The town of Dry Creek woke that morning to the sound of boots and iron. A dust storm had not yet settled, but men were already gathering in the square, faces hardened, voices echoing with anger and judgment. 3 warriors stood beneath the gallows, bare-chested, proud, their wrists bound to the wooden beam above. Their shadows stretched long across the dirt, framed by the sun that rose like a merciless overseer. They did not beg, nor did they cry. The people wanted a show, and the sheriff was ready to give it. Among the crowd, a woman sat on a brown mare, her dark hair tied loosely beneath a faded bonnet. Her dress strained at the seams where her belly curved forward, heavy with child. She had ridden through the night, her hands trembling against the reins, her voice rehearsing the words she would have to speak. Her face was pale, her lips dry, yet her eyes held the kind of fire that only grief can feed. "Please," she said, barely loud enough for the men in the front row to hear. "Don't do this." Her plea was swallowed by the noise of boots, laughter, and metal clanging against wood. The sheriff ignored her. His hand rested near his revolver, thumb brushing the worn grip. "Those men killed 3 settlers," he said, not looking at her. "They'll hang by noon, same as we promised." She dismounted slowly, clutching her stomach as if the life inside her might fall apart. The gold pouch on her saddle hit the ground with a dull thud. The sound drew the crowd's eyes. Dust lifted around it like smoke. "Please." "Take my gold," she said again, louder this time. Her voice shook, but it carried. "Take it all, but the lives of those men are mine." The sheriff turned then, his jaw tightening. "Yours?" he asked, almost mocking. "You think you can buy justice, widow?" "They saved me," she whispered, her voice trembling under the weight of the memory. "They saved my life and my child's when no one else would." The onlookers shifted uneasily. No one spoke. In that small western town, the word of a widow meant little against the blood debt of settlers. Yet something in her tone, something desperate and rock-cut through the dust and the pride that hung in the air. The gallows creaked. The 3 men did not flinch. They stood tall, their eyes steady on the horizon where the land bled into the sky. They looked at her only once, and in that glance there was recognition. Pain, yes, but also a silent bond. The kind that's forged in danger and sealed by gratitude. One of the townsmen shouted their savages, "Let them swing." And the tension snapped like a whip. A murmur rose again, angry and impatient. The widow stepped forward until the sun hit her face. Sweat rolled down her temple, and her breathing grew uneven. She was shaken, but she refused to back away. "You call them savages," she said, "but where were you when the storm came down the canyon? Where were you when my wagon broke and the wolves circled? When I screamed for help, they came." "Not you," her voice cracked, but she went on. "I gave them bread, they gave me fire. I gave them water, they gave me life. And now you hang them because you're afraid to owe them anything." A silence followed, thin, sharp, and heavy. Somewhere in the crowd, a man cleared his throat, uneasy. The sheriff looked at her again, then at the pouch of gold in the dirt. He spat once, the gesture of a man who wished things were simpler. "Lady," he said, "this isn't about kindness. It's about the law." "The law," she said, clutching her belly. "Then what law saves a woman when her home burns? What law stops hunger when there's no one left to help?" The sheriff's eyes hardened. "Enough." He nodded toward his deputy. The man reached for the lever. "No," she screamed, stumbling forward. Her voice tore through the crowd like a rifle crack. The hangman froze. The warriors' chests rose and fell, steady and calm. As if they already knew the outcome, she fell to her knees, her hands digging into the dirt. "Please," she said again, softer now. "If you won't take the gold, take me. But don't take them."
Ow.
No one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice called out. "Sheriff," said an older rancher, wiping sweat from his brow. "Let the woman speak her truth. We can hang them after if it don't change nothing." The sheriff hesitated. The sun was hot now, glaring down on every face, and something about the way she knelt there broken, yet unbending made, even the hardest men uneasy. He gave a short nod. "You've got 1 minute." She rose slowly, her voice trembling as she began. "A month ago, my husband was killed on the trail. He was trying to bring me home before the baby came. We were ambushed near the ridge. He fought, but they shot him before sunrise. I ran. I don't remember how far, but I remember falling, bleeding, and praying to die before the wolves found me." The crowd listened in silence now. Even the sheriff's hand lowered from his gun. "I woke up in the firelight," she continued. "One of those men had carried me to a cave. They wrapped my wounds, shared their food. They spoke little English, but I saw no hate in their eyes. Only mercy. They could have left me there. But they didn't. They carried me for 3 days through the canyon until I reached a trading post. And now," her voice broke, and she pressed her hand against her stomach. "Now you call them killers." Her words hung in the air, trembling like the dust that refused to settle. The sheriff's gaze shifted to the men hanging above the ground. Their faces remained still, unreadable, but the faintest glimmer passed between them and the widow. A connection forged not in blood, but in something deeper, even if they did save you. The sheriff said, "There's still 3 bodies buried up north." "That's justice talking." "No," she said quietly. "That's revenge." The crowd murmured again, uneasy, unsure. The wind picked up, swirling dust around the gallows. The gold pouch still lay in the dirt, half buried, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. The sheriff exhaled. "You've got guts, widow, but words won't buy freedom." Her hand trembled as she reached for the pouch. She lifted it high, the coins glinting like captured sunlight. "Then let this buy it," she said. "Every ounce my husband ever worked for, every dream he ever had. I'll trade it all for their lives." The men on the beam finally looked at each other, then down at her. One of them said something in his own language, his voice deep and steady, carried by the wind. No one understood the words, but their tone made even the sheriff pause. The widow's breathing grew ragged. "Take the gold," she said, voice fading, "but let them live, please. The lives of those men are mine." The sheriff hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every eye in the town was on him now. Behind him, the deputy's hand hovered over the lever. The horses snorted, the ropes creaked, and somewhere far in the distance, thunder rolled. The widow's fingers loosened, and the pouch fell again, bursting open on the dirt. Gold spilled everywhere, flashing like sunlight over graves. The sheriff's hand twitched. No. One knew what he'd decide, and before anyone could speak again, a gunshot cracked the air sharp, unexpected. Echoing through the street, the crowd screamed. The horses reared. The widow stumbled back, clutching her stomach, her face pale as snow. The story of Dry Creek had just changed forever. The echo of that single gunshot tore through Dry Creek like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one knew who had fired or where the bullet had gone. The horses neighed and kicked at the dirt, scattering dust into the air. Men shouted, women gasped, and the sheriff spun around, his hand gripping his revolver. The widow stood frozen, her face pale and her lips trembling, clutching her swollen belly as though she could feel the shock deep inside her child. The sound still hung heavy in the air, as if the whole town had forgotten how to breathe. Then silence. The crowd stared in every direction, eyes searching for the source. A man near the saloon pointed toward the hill that overlooked the town. Up there. He shouted, "Smoke." The sheriff squinted into the bright sun, and sure enough, a faint wisp of rifle smoke curled above the ridge. Whoever had fired wasn't aiming to kill but to warn. To interrupt, get them inside. The sheriff barked, motioning toward the warriors. His deputies rushed to pull them down from the beam, cutting the ropes before the crowd could protest. The men dropped to their knees, wrists still bound, but their expressions stayed unreadable, almost calm. The sheriff glanced at the widow. "You stay put." But she didn't listen. She rushed forward, kneeling beside the nearest warrior, who had fallen hard on his shoulder. Her hands shook as she reached out to check his wounds. The sight of her tenderness, Her concern for men branded as enemies only deepened the confusion in the crowd. A murmur spread. "Maybe she's one of them," someone whispered. "Maybe her husband's death ain't what she says." The sheriff shot a glare toward the voices, silencing them. But he knew those words wouldn't fade easily. Gossip traveled faster than bullets in towns like Dry Creek. As the warriors were dragged toward the jailhouse, the widow followed, her skirts brushing against the dust, her breathing shallow. She felt eyes on her back, judging, accusing. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she couldn't stop. She had come too far, risked too much. Inside the small jail, the air was thick with heat and iron. The sheriff ordered the men locked in separate cells, his deputies standing guard by the door. The widow leaned against the wall, exhausted, her hand still resting on her belly. "You got yourself in a mess," the sheriff said quietly, lighting a cigar. "If you know who fired that gun, now's the time to tell me." She shook her head. "I don't." He studied her for a long moment, the flame from his match flickering in his eyes. "I don't believe you," he said finally. "But I do believe you think you owe these men something. That kind of debt can get you killed out here." She looked up, her voice steady, though her eyes glistened. "You think I care about dying? Those men saved my life when everyone else turned away." The sheriff didn't answer. He walked toward the window, peering out at the fading smoke on the ridge. Whoever had fired that shot was gone now, swallowed by the hills. Outside, the town was still buzzing. The people of Dry Creek were not cruel, but they were afraid of the unknown, afraid of stories they didn't understand. For weeks, they had been living on edge. 2 wagon parties had vanished along the river trail, and every loss demanded a face to blame. These 3 warriors had simply been the ones unlucky enough to be caught nearby. The widow, whose name few in town even knew, had arrived from the east a month ago. Her husband had been a prospector, chasing a promise of gold deep into the desert. He'd written to her that he'd found something worth the risk, something that would change their lives. But when she came searching for him, she found only his grave and a burned wagon. She buried him herself, marked the spot with a stone, and wandered for days before collapsing from hunger and pain. That's when the warriors found her. She remembered it clearly now, the night she woke in their camp. The firelight dancing across their faces. They hadn't spoken her language, but they'd tended her wounds and shared their food. She'd seen one of them carry her over a canyon crossing, his steps sure and steady, never complaining. They could have robbed her, could have left her to die, but instead they brought her to safety. Now those same men sat behind iron bars, branded as murderers. As the sheriff turned away, the widow took a deep breath. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Those men aren't killers. And why were they found near the bodies?" he asked. "Because they were trying to bury them," she said quietly. "Because they were trying to do what none of your men would have done." Ow! The sheriff stopped mid-step, his jaw tightening. "You've got a lot of faith in strangers, widow." "Too much, if you ask me." "They're not strangers," she said softly. "Not to me." The sheriff didn't reply. He simply walked out, slamming the door behind him. That night, the town stayed restless. Lanterns burned in windows long after midnight, and whispers carried through the alleys. Some said the gunshot came from another warrior watching from the hills. Others swore it was the ghost of the widow's husband, come to stop a hanging. No one knew for sure, but fear grew thicker than the dust. Inside the jailhouse, the widow sat by the cell bars, her hands clasped tightly. The warrior nearest to her watched in silence. His dark eyes reflected the lamplight, calm and deep. Like the river that had nearly taken her life weeks ago, she whispered, "Why did you come for me that night?" He said nothing, but his gaze didn't waver. Slowly, he lifted his hand, the one still bound in rope, and pointed toward her belly. Then he pressed his palm to his chest. She understood. He hadn't saved her just because she was a woman in danger. He'd saved her because she carried life. Because in his world, to protect life, even that of an enemy, was sacred. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She looked at him again and whispered, "I'll get you out of here. I swear it." The next morning brought no peace. The sheriff had gathered a posse to search the ridge for the riflemen. The sun had barely risen when they rode out, leaving the town tense and uncertain. By noon, the widow stepped into the general store, her shawl pulled tight, and bought supplies she couldn't afford: water, a small knife, a coil of rope. The shopkeeper watched her curiously. "You heading somewhere, ma'am?" She forced a faint smile. "Just preparing. A mother's got to think ahead," but her eyes betrayed her secret. That afternoon, a storm gathered over the hills, dark clouds rolling fast. Wind whipped through the streets, carrying grit and the smell of rain. The townsfolk hurried indoors as thunder growled low in the distance. In the jailhouse, the deputies played cards by lamplight, unaware that the door at the back of the building was slowly being worked loose by a blade. Outside, beneath the howl of the wind, the widow's hands bled as she pried the wood apart inch by inch. The rain had started to fall, masking the sound of her work. She slipped inside, heart pounding, soaked through. The warriors looked up in silence as she knelt by the first cell. Her hands trembled as she pulled the knife from her belt. "Don't speak," she whispered. "They'll hear us." The blade scraped the lock, useless at first, until the old iron finally gave way. The door creaked open, and one of the warriors stepped free, rubbing his wrists where the rope had cut deep. He looked at her not with surprise, but with something close to sorrow. "You shouldn't be here," his voice broke the silence. Low and hoarse. "Neither should you," she said. Forcing a faint smile, the other two were freed moments later. The storm raged harder now, thunder masking every noise. But as they turned toward the back door, a voice shouted from the hall, "Stop right there." The deputy's revolver gleamed in the lamplight. His hand shook slightly, but his finger was on the trigger. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The widow stood frozen, caught between fear and resolve. The rain hammered the roof. The warriors stood still, their muscles tensed, eyes fixed on the deputy. Then a gust of wind blew the door wide. Lightning flashed, and everything erupted at once. A struggle, a shout, a crash. The lamp fell, flames licking the floorboards. The widow screamed, trying to drag the fallen deputy away, but smoke filled the air. One of the warriors grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door. They burst out into the storm, rain soaking them to the bone. Behind them, the jailhouse glowed orange in the darkness. The widow gasped for breath, clutching her stomach. The warrior looked back once, the fire reflecting in his eyes. In the distance, thunder rolled again, and the faint sound of hooves echoed from the ridge. Someone was coming. They didn't know if it was rescue or revenge. The rain came down hard through the night, turning the dirt roads of Dry Creek into rivers of mud. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the town had changed. The jailhouse still smoldered in the early light, its blackened remains standing as a reminder that something dark had broken free. The sheriff returned with his posse at sunrise to find nothing but ashes and rumors. Tracks led north toward the canyon, where the river cut through red rock. Hoofprints and footprints mixed together, fading where the rain had washed the ground clean. The sheriff dismounted, kneeling beside a patch of churned mud. He touched the earth, still damp, and looked up toward the horizon. "They couldn't have gotten far," he muttered. One of his men, a ranch hand turned deputy, spat into the mud. "The folks are scared, Sheriff. Some are saying she's turned outlaw now. Helping them means she's one of them." The sheriff said nothing. He looked back toward the town where smoke still curled from the ruins. The widow had risked everything for those three men, and he couldn't decide if that made her brave or foolish. Either way, her choice had put Dry Creek on edge. By mid-morning, word had spread to the nearby ranches. Some wanted to ride out and finish what the law had started. Others whispered about leaving town before trouble came knocking. In the saloon, a few men gathered, their voices low and bitter. They spoke of raids, stolen cattle, the fear that the wilderness beyond the ridge was waking up again. Meanwhile, deep in the canyon, the widow and the warriors took shelter beneath an overhang of rock. The fire they'd built was small, hidden from view. The smoke curled softly into the damp air, vanishing before it reached the sky. Her dress was torn and her face pale. but her eyes stayed fixed on the flames. The oldest of the warriors sat across from her, silent as ever. His gaze was distant, heavy with thoughts he did not share. The younger one cleaned the blade that had cut their bonds, while the third kept watch near the canyon wall. They moved with quiet purpose, each motion deliberate and controlled, as if they'd lived their whole lives on the edge of danger. The widow finally broke the silence. "They'll come for us," she said softly. The young warrior looked at her, then nodded once. He pointed toward the east. "River," he said. "Follow river, hide." She looked down at her hands, raw from the fire and the struggle. "I can't keep running forever. I'm with child. I need food, shelter." The older warrior spoke then, his voice low and rough, shaped by an accent heavy with old words. "Safe place," he said. 2 days. 2 days, she whispered, almost to herself. She wasn't sure she could manage 2 more hours in her condition. But when she looked into their faces, she saw no doubt, only patience, the kind born of hardship. They moved as soon as the light began to fade. The canyon narrowed, the red stone walls rising high around them. The widow leaned against her horse, walking beside it, her steps slow but steady. Each sound, the wind, the river, the creak of saddle leather, seemed sharper, as though the land itself was listening. By the time the stars came out, they had reached a clearing surrounded by cottonwoods. The warrior stopped to rest, and she sank to the ground, exhausted. One of them handed her a piece of dried meat. She hesitated, then took it. "You could have left me behind," she said quietly. "Why didn't you?" The young warrior looked at her, puzzled by the question. He gestured toward her belly again and said something in his language. She caught one word: life. Her throat tightened. "Life," she repeated. "That's what my husband said before he died. He told me to protect it, no matter the cost." The warrior nodded, understanding. For a long while, they sat in silence beneath the whisper of the trees. Back in Dry Creek, the sheriff's patience had worn thin. He called a meeting in the saloon, and nearly every man in town showed up. The air was thick with smoke and frustration. "We can't sit here waiting," one man said. "They burned our jail. Next, they'll come for our stock or our homes." "They didn't burn it," the sheriff said. "The lamp fell during a fight. It was an accident." "Accident?" Another man snapped. "They escaped, didn't they? You think that woman's innocent? She freed them." The sheriff slammed his hand on the table, the noise silencing the room. "She's a widow, carrying a child. You want to hang her too?" No one answered. The sheriff leaned forward, his voice calm but cold. "You all forget those men didn't kill anyone we can prove. You found them near the scene, but you don't know what really happened. And now, you want to play executioner?" A miner near the back muttered, "Justice ain't worth much when it comes to late." The sheriff looked out the window toward the horizon, his jaw tight. "I'll find them," he said. "But I'll bring them back alive. You have my word." As he left the saloon, the sound of angry voices followed him into the night. The next morning, the posse rode out again, this time with trackers and rifles. The sheriff led them into the hills, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of movement. Every broken branch, every footprint told a story, and he read it like a map of guilt and desperation. Far ahead, the widow and the warriors crossed the river at dawn. The cold water bit into her skin, but she didn't complain. Her legs trembled, her breath came in gasps, but she pressed on. The baby kicked, reminding her of why she couldn't stop. By midday, they reached a small plateau, overlooking the valley below. From there, they could see the faint trail of riders in the distance. The sheriff was closing in. The young warrior pointed toward a narrow path hidden between rocks. "This way," he said. She hesitated, looking back at the smoke trails rising far behind them. "They won't stop," she whispered. "He won't stop." The older warrior met her eyes. "He hunts because he must," he said, "but not forever." The path led them to an old settlement, long abandoned. The remains of log huts and stone chimneys stood silent beneath the sky. It was there they made camp again, hidden among the ruins. The widow walked through the empty cabins, her hand brushing against broken furniture and shattered glass. She could almost hear the laughter of families who once lived there, the echo of lives swallowed by time. That night, as the fire crackled, she dreamed of her husband. He stood at the edge of a canyon, calling her name. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with sorrow. When she reached for him, he vanished into the wind. Leaving behind only the sound of his voice protects life, no matter the cost. She woke with tears on her cheeks. Outside, the warriors sat quietly, speaking in low tones. The young one noticed her and nodded toward the horizon. "They come," he said simply. Far in the distance, torchlight flickered. The posse was moving through the valley. The sheriff rode at the front, his face set in grim determination, but he wasn't the only one following them. From the ridges on both sides, shadows moved silently among the rocks. More warriors, perhaps from the same tribe, were watching. The sheriff didn't know it yet, but he was riding into a trap. The widow saw them first, her figures outlined by moonlight. She turned to the man who had carried her through the desert weeks ago. "They'll kill him," she said. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "He would kill us. He's only doing what he thinks is right," she said. "He's not evil. He's just blind." The warrior's gaze softened. "You speak like you know his heart." She lowered her eyes. "Because I've seen what hatred does to people. It took my husband. It took this land. I won't let it take anyone else." The warrior studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you must choose soon," he said. "Before the sun rises, blood will fall." The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of rain and smoke. The widow looked toward the east, where the first light of dawn began to color the sky. Between the law and the hunted, between mercy and revenge, she stood on the edge of two worlds, one that had lost its faith, and one still fighting to hold on to it. And as the thunder rumbled across the valley, she knew that by the next sunrise, nothing in Dry Creek would ever be the same again. The morning air was thick and still, carrying the scent of wet earth and smoke. The valley below the ridge stretched wide and silent, but beneath that quiet ran a tension that every living soul could feel. The sheriff's posse moved cautiously through the brush, their horses snorting and hooves sinking into soft ground. The men were tired, but their eyes stayed sharp, searching the rocks and shadows for any sign of movement. Above them, the sun began to burn away the mist, turning the canyon gold. The sheriff rode at the front, his hand resting on his rifle. He didn't trust the silence. It was too deep, too heavy. Every now and then he'd glance behind him, counting his men, but what really held his attention was the ridge ahead. He could feel it, the sense that someone was watching. From her hiding place among the old ruins, the widow saw them too. Her breath caught as she spotted the faint glint of sunlight on gun barrels. The posse had reached the mouth of the canyon. Her pulse quickened. The warriors crouched low beside her, their expressions unreadable, their movements steady. They had been waiting all night for this moment. The older warrior, the one who had led them this far, placed his hand over the ground as if feeling the heartbeat of the land. He looked up at the younger one and gave a short nod. The younger warrior moved away silently, melting into the brush along the ridge. Another followed, vanishing into shadow. They were preparing for what could not be avoided. The widow's heart pounded as she realized what they meant to do. "No," she whispered, reaching out. "You can't fight them. If you kill them, there'll be no turning back." The older man met her gaze calmly. "They come to kill," he said simply. "We do not run anymore." "You don't understand," she pleaded. "That sheriff? He's not like the others. He'll listen if he finds me alive. But if you fight him, he'll never stop." He said nothing more, but his silence was answer enough. The wind began to rise, carrying with it the smell of dust and iron. Down below, the sheriff raised his hand to halt his men. "Something's wrong," he muttered. He dismounted, motioning for the others to spread out. The ground was uneven, filled with dry brush and scattered stones, perfect ground for an ambush. He crouched beside a set of tracks leading into the rocks and studied them closely. They were fresh. A young deputy, his nerves already worn thin, shifted uneasily. "Sheriff, maybe we should turn back. Regroup in town." "Wait till they come down." "They won't come down," the sheriff said quietly. "They'll make their stand up there." As the words left his mouth, A distant sound echoed through the canyon, one sharp, high cry of a bird. The sheriff froze. The sound came again, this time followed by movement on the ridge. His instincts flared. "Take cover!" he shouted. Gunfire erupted. The first shots came from above, slamming into the dirt near their horses. The posse scattered, some firing back blindly, others diving behind rocks. The air filled with smoke and shouting. The sheriff rolled behind a fallen log and peered through the haze. He could barely see them, figures moving fast among the rocks, blending with the land itself. One of his men cried out and fell. Another horse reared, throwing its rider into the dust. The sheriff gritted his teeth and fired a single shot toward the ridge. He wasn't aiming to kill, he was aiming to warn. Up above, the widow flinched at the sound. She wanted to scream, to make it stop, but her voice caught in her throat. The older warrior stood beside her, calm as stone, loading his rifle with practiced hands. "Go," he said, nodding toward the opposite path. "Take the river. It is your only way." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving." He turned to her then, his eyes sharp. "You carry life. You must go." Sound of bullets striking stone filled the air again. Sparks flew. A rock shattered beside them, and she ducked, pressing her hands over her ears. The older warrior stepped forward, his face set. He wasn't fighting for victory, he was fighting to buy time. The younger warrior reappeared from the shadows, his breath ragged. He spoke quickly in his language, gesturing toward the ridge behind them. The widow didn't understand, but she could see the fear flicker across his face. More riders were coming, reinforcements. The sheriff's men had sent for help. The widow grabbed the arm of the younger warrior. "If you fight them all, you'll die." He didn't answer. Instead, he placed his hand over her heart for a brief moment, a gesture that felt like both farewell and promise, then turned and ran back toward the ridge. Below, the sheriff saw the movement and aimed again, but when he saw the faint shape of the woman behind the rocks, he lowered his rifle. His chest tightened. "She's still alive," he muttered. "She's with them." His deputy stared at him, confused. "Then what do we do? You gonna shoot her too?" The sheriff didn't answer. He stared up at the ridge, torn between duty and doubt. Something in her voice from that day at the gallows kept replaying in his mind. Those words, "They saved me." He wanted to believe her. But now, men were dead. The gunfire slowed, replaced by the echoing clicks of reloading weapons. Smoke drifted between the canyon walls, curling upward like a warning. The sheriff raised his hand and shouted, "Hold your fire!" For a moment, the world went still. Only the wind answered him. He stepped out from behind the log, his hands open. "You hear me up there?" he called. "We don't want more blood. Send the woman down." The widow heard his voice and froze. It was strange how calm he sounded, even after all this. The older warrior looked at her, then toward the canyon below. "He wants you," he said. She hesitated, torn between fear and trust. "If I go, will he stop?" The warrior didn't answer. The sheriff's voice rose again, echoing against the cliffs. "If you come down, I give you my word you won't be harmed." The younger warrior had returned, his arm grazed by a bullet. He shook his head fiercely. "No, trap," he said, pointing to the canyon. More men come. And then they all heard it, the low, steady drum of hooves. The widow turned and saw dust rising from the valley floor. More riders. Not from the sheriff's party. These were different. Men from town, farmers and miners, carrying rifles, hungry for vengeance. They were closing in from the other side of the canyon. Her heart sank. There was nowhere left to run. The warriors exchanged quick glances. The older one reached into his pouch and pulled out a small carved token, pressing it into her hand. It was shaped like a bird, worn smooth by time. "For the child," he said. "If we fall, you go north. The river will lead you." Tears filled her eyes. "You can't stay. You'll be slaughtered." He looked at her gently, almost as if smiling. "We were born on this land. We do not run from it." Below, the sheriff's men were regrouping. He could hear the other riders closing in from behind. His gut twisted. He hadn't asked for this. He'd only wanted justice, not a massacre. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. Not like this. He turned to his deputy. Stay with the men. Don't fire unless I say. Then he started walking forward, slowly, toward the base of the ridge. When the widow saw him coming, her breath caught. He's coming alone, she whispered. The younger warrior raised his rifle, but she grabbed it, shaking her head. No, please, let me speak to him. The older warrior's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. The sheriff climbed until he could see her clearly, her hair loose in the wind. Her dress torn and dirty, her eyes burning with defiance and fear. He stopped a few feet away, his hands still open. You don't have to die here, he said quietly. Neither do they. She took a shaky breath. Then call your men back. I can't, he said. They're scared. And scared men don't listen. Then you're no different from them, she said. Something flickered across his face. Shame, maybe, or memory. Maybe I ain't, he said softly. But I came here to end this without more killing. Behind her, the young warrior whispered something urgent. The sheriff saw his movement and instinctively turned his head. A shout came from below. The townsmen had reached the canyon floor and were spreading out. The widow's voice trembled. They're going to attack. The sheriff looked down, saw the rifles being raised, and shouted, Hold your fire. But the wind carried his voice away, swallowed by the thunder of hooves. A single shot cracked the silence. Then another. The valley exploded into chaos. The warriors fired back, the echoes bouncing off the cliffs. The sheriff dove for cover as bullets tore through the rocks above him. The widow screamed, ducking as splinters of stone rained around her. The older warrior pulled her toward the path behind the ruins. The smoke thickened, the air filling with dust and noise. Horses whinnied, men shouted, rifles cracked. The canyon was on fire with rage. The sheriff crawled toward the rocks, trying to see through the haze. Somewhere above, he caught sight of the widow running, her dress flashing white between bursts of gunfire. He shouted her name, but his voice was lost in the storm of war that had finally come to Dry Creek. The gunfire faded slowly, replaced by the distant echo of thunder rolling across the valley. Smoke hung heavy in the air, curling upward from the burning brush. The sun, half hidden behind the haze, cast a dull orange glow over the battlefield that had once been quiet land. Bodies lay scattered between rocks and shattered wagons, rifles still clutched in hands that would never move again. The screams had stopped, and in that silence, the wind began to speak again. The sheriff pushed himself up from the dirt, his ears ringing, his coat torn. His rifle was gone, buried somewhere under the rubble, but he didn't care. He staggered forward, his boots sinking into the soft earth. All he could think about was the woman, the widow who had begged him once to see truth where others saw hate. He found her near the edge of the ridge, half hidden by smoke. Her dress was ripped, her face streaked with dirt and tears. One of the warriors lay beside her, the young one, his chest still. The older one knelt nearby, pressing his hand over a wound on his side, blood running down his arm. The moment the sheriff appeared, the old warrior's eyes hardened, but there was no strength left to fight. The widow turned, her eyes meeting the sheriff's. You shouldn't have come, she whispered. He stopped a few feet away, lowering his head. I didn't come to kill you, he said quietly. I came to end this before more lives were lost. Her voice broke as she looked down at the young warrior. You were too late, sheriff's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, kneeling beside the fallen man. He had seen plenty of death in his life, but something about this one struck deep. A boy who had fought not for revenge, but to protect a woman and an unborn child who were never his own. The old warrior looked at him, breathing shallowly. You fight your own people now? He asked in broken English. The sheriff hesitated, then shook his head. No, I fight for what's right. The warrior gave a faint smile. Then maybe. There is hope. He closed his eyes, his hand falling limp to his side. The widow leaned over him, tears sliding down her cheeks. The sheriff stepped back, removing his hat, his voice low. I'll see he's buried proper." The air was still again. The last gunshots had long since faded, and the men who had ridden from town were retreating. Some wounded, some too ashamed to look back. The sheriff watched them disappear into the distance. None of them had wanted this, not truly, but fear had done what reason never could. It had burned through the town like wildfire. The widow struggled to her feet, swaying. The sheriff caught her arm, steadying her. "You need a doctor," he said. "I need peace," she whispered. Her eyes drifted toward the hills. "They gave me that once. Now I just have to live long enough to give it back." He nodded, unsure what to say. "The town will come looking again," he warned. She shook her head. "Not for me. Not anymore." Together they buried the fallen before sunset. The sheriff dug with his bare hands until the blisters split, and the widow laid a small token, the carved bird the old warrior had given her on the fresh mound of earth. The wind rustled through the grass, soft and mournful, like a prayer carried to the heavens. As the sky turned crimson, the sheriff helped her onto her horse. The light caught her face, tired but calm. "Where will you go?" he asked. "North," she said. "To the river. He told me to follow it." He nodded slowly. "It's a long way." "Come farther," she said, her voice steady. He looked down, his hat turning slowly in his hands. "If anyone asks," he said quietly, "I'll tell them you died in the fire." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time she saw not the man who had ordered the gallows, but someone who had learned what mercy costs. "Thank you," she said softly. The sheriff stepped back as she nudged the horse forward. The animal hesitated, as if sensing her pain, then began to move. She rode slowly through the valley, her figure fading into the golden haze. The wind carried the faint sound of the river ahead, the promise of life still waiting somewhere beyond the hills. When she was gone, the sheriff stood for a long time, staring at the place where she had disappeared. The sky darkened, and one by one the stars came out. The war in Dry Creek had ended, but its scars would stay. He turned and began the slow walk back toward town, each step heavier than the last. By the time he reached the edge of Dry Creek, the townsfolk had already gathered, waiting for answers. Their faces were drawn and weary, their eyes filled with the kind of questions that had no clean answer. The saloon owner stepped forward. "Did you get them?" The sheriff paused. "No," he said. "It's over." Another man spat into the dirt. "You let them go?" "I let peace go," the sheriff said quietly. "You can chase it all you want, but you won't catch it with a rifle." The crowd murmured among themselves, some angry, others uncertain, but none dared challenge him. He walked past them without another word and into his office, closing the door behind him. Inside, the smell of smoke and whiskey filled the air. He poured himself a drink, his hands trembling slightly. On the desk lay a piece of paper report he'd started days ago. It was supposed to detail the arrest and execution of 3 men. Now it would tell a different story. He sat down and began to write, each word slower than the last. He wrote about a woman who rode through the desert with nothing but a promise and a heartbeat. About 3 warriors who had shown mercy to a stranger when the world had shown them none. About a town that forgot what kindness looked like until it was too late. When he finished, he set the paper aside and looked out the window. The moon hung low over the hills, silver and still. Somewhere beyond that horizon, he imagined her riding along the river, holding her belly, whispering to the life she carried about the world she wanted to build. Weeks passed. Dry Creek began to rebuild. The gallows were taken down, and in their place, the townsfolk planted a tree of small cottonwood that grew quickly under the warm sun. People said the sheriff ordered it himself, though no one saw him do it, sometimes at night. The wind would whistle through the branches, and the sound reminded him of a woman's voice, the same one that had pleaded, "Please, take my gold. But the lives of those men are mine." He never forgot that moment, or how it had changed everything. Months later, word came from a trader passing through that a woman matching her description had been seen farther north near the riverlands. She was living in a small cabin, tending a garden, her child born healthy. She kept mostly to herself, the trader said. But sometimes she'd walk to the water and leave small wooden carvings on the rock's tiny birds, shaped by hand, smoothed by time. The sheriff listened to the story without a word. He simply nodded and looked out toward the hills. "Good," he said finally. "Let her be." He never saw her again. But sometimes, when the wind swept down through the canyons, carrying the scent of pine and water, he thought he could hear the faint echo of a lullaby. Drifting from far away, the town of Dry Creek lived on, smaller now, quieter. People spoke less of vengeance and more of survival. The sheriff grew older, his hair turning gray, his hands rough from years of work. But in his heart, he carried the memory of that Datha, gold scattered on the dirt, the plea of a woman who had lost everything, and the 3 men who had died with honor. And somewhere beyond the desert, beside the gentle river, a child grew up hearing a different kind of story, a story about courage and forgiveness, about how love can survive even the harshest land, about how a single act of mercy can change the fate of an entire town. When the wind blew through Dry Creek, the people would say it sounded like wings soft, distant, and free.